This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. Created by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome to A Brush With, the podcast where I talk to artists about their cultural experiences and influences, the artists that have inspired them across their career, the writers and poets they draw on, the music they listen to and respond to in their work, and the cultural epiphanies that have changed their lives. And in this episode, it's A Brush With Ellen Gallagher, one of the most dynamic and endlessly fascinating artists working today. Her main media are painting and drawing, but Ellen's also worked in sculpture and in collaboration with Edgar Klein in film and animation. She was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1965 to an Irish mother and a father born in the United States to parents from the Cape Verde archipelago off the west coast of Africa. She now lives in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Her father's ancestry in particular has been crucial in defining much of the territory of Ellen's work, as you'll hear in this conversation. Much of her practice relates to the history, culture, language and mythologies of the Black diaspora. After she'd studied at Oberlin College in Ohio, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine, Ellen developed a distinctive take on abstraction and minimalist art. Her work may have looked spare, almost like Agnes Martin from a distance, but up close, her paintings were formed from hundreds of drawn or painted lips, wigs or eyeballs, which Ellen referred to as the disembodied ephemera of minstrelsy, the racist blackface entertainment common in the US from the 19th century onwards. She achieved acclaim for these early paintings and has since developed several similarly powerful and arresting bodies of work. In the early 2000s, she began taking adverts and feature articles from black-orientated magazines like Ebony and transforming them with yellow and white plasticine in brilliantly inventive ways. Many of the adverts were for wigs, and in Ellen's hands, these hairpieces become a platform for wonderfully imaginative sculptural reliefs made with the plasticine, riffing on the adverts and imagery and inscribed with witty, sardonic or politically incisive forms, from light bulbs, rockets and question marks to bananas and fire hoses. They're presented in vast grids made up in some cases of more than 300 individual images. Another series began in the early 2000s, but still ongoing, sums up the formal and conceptual balance of Ellen's work. It's called Watery Ecstatic and consists of wonderfully poetic, sometimes delicate, often hugely powerful oceanic imagery, realised in watercolour, ink and oil, with cut paper and collage. In some works in the series, those disembodied eyes from the Minstrelsy series appear again, and here they relate to an Afro-futurist myth at the core of the Watery Ecstatic series. This is the myth of Drexciya, developed by the Detroit techno band of the same name. Drexciya is essentially a black Atlantis at the bottom of the Atlantic, a society formed by the pregnant enslaved women who were thrown or threw themselves from slave ships during the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas. As you'll hear, that series and works relating to it, such as a recent body of work called Ecstatic Draft of Fishes, draw on a wealth of cultural references in addition to Detroit techno, from historic art to Herman Melville's novels and novellas to marine biology and Ellen's own family story. They also call on an array of techniques. Ellen's paintings are endlessly intriguing in terms of their formal invention, their colour, texture and tone. There is, indeed, an ebb and flow within her language, her forms and language shifting, sometimes reappearing, yet constantly evolving. In the Ecstatic Draft of Fishes series, for instance, alongside novel elements, she uses the penmanship paper or handwriting paper that was the basis of her earliest paintings, from which her compositions grew. And it's with this that I began our conversation. How did she discover the penmanship paper, and why did she use it as the ground for what's become an extraordinarily rich body of work over 3 decades?
My father's neighborhood is called Fox Point. It's in Providence, Rhode Island. It's sort of on the edge of where Rhode Island School of Design and Brown University are. It's been really gentrified recently. Well, over this sort of period of 30 years, we've really seen it change. But what happened in the 60s is that the Robert Moses designed highway infrastructure came in to the East Coast around 95 and I-95, and that community was decimated already. And you started to see the effects through my childhood. So by the 70s, what had been a really intense community that was bound to the sea, they came over as whalers, and so they sort of settled into the port of Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm from. It was just an incredible neighborhood with lots of boys' clubs and community groups. And it was really a really strong environment that slowly we saw get erased. And certainly by the time Ronald Reagan came to power, he started closing down all the pools. He emptied out the pools. And, my cousin had been a lifeguard. I learned to swim in the neighborhood pools. And the pools around Providence, Rhode Island were a big part of my life. They were, these sort of turquoise rectangles in the middle of these urban environments that were just really wild. We were just wild and screaming, and it was, they were just really these beautiful spaces that you see now. There were all these emptied pools by the 80s, by the mid 80s. So I was walking in my father's neighborhood in around, I think this would have been somewhere between 1990 and 1991. And so then again, there were the empty pools. The neighborhood had been quite emptied out already, slowly becoming gentrified now by the students because the community had left it, this emptiness. So this community is first cut off by the Robert Moses Highway from the sea and also from the heart of Providence. And my father used to actually walk my brother and I across the highway to get into the city. And, because he said it was our right. They had really taken this from us. And in one of these playgrounds, I found a piece of paper that was folded up. And it was penmanship paper. I unfolded it, and it said in this really beautiful block handwriting, "We are a drug-free school. Have a nice day." And do you remember that was Nancy Reagan's thing, just say no. And so there was this just say no kind of message, this bland message with this happy face. And it just was so poignant to me. And then the sort of the flesh of the paper, I think I liked that it was somehow living, that it had already darkened over the time it had been on the ground, and it was so carefully folded. So I took it home with me and I thought about it, and I ended up buying a bunch of penmanship paper, and I began working with them into the canvas. And I think I made my first penmanship paper painting between 91 and 92.
And one of the things about it, as you talk about that sort of aging, the way it changes, it seems to me that that's a consistent concern in all your work, that in a sense, all the materials as well as the forms are somehow in flux, are mutable. Or
they're unstable, they're living. And also that, paper is really interesting because edges of paper, they age from the corners in. So I also think that's really interesting, the way they age. And yeah, and it's true. The materials, the plasticine is as well as something that is never fixed. I could certainly cast those forms. And I have done that when I've made special editions. I've made something out of plasticine and then cast it in a more permanent rubber. But I really love that there is something in the work that is fighting against this idea of fixedness,
At the opening of your Tate Modern retrospective in 2013, there is one of your works, which is quite singular in your practice, but it was presented almost like a manifesto in the sense it was on its own and it was right at the start of the show. And it is an image, which is a 1928 photograph of Matisse and a model in this oriental interior. Can you tell me something about that work, why you took it, and of course, why you adapted and how you adapted it?
Right. Well, the work was made for an exhibition I did at the Freud Museum. I very much wanted to be in conversation, not just with the Freud Museum, which is in St. John's Wood in London. I wanted to be in conversation with the other women artists that have made exhibitions there. It's been a really important site. That was part of the conversation as well with those artists. And I was thinking about what Edward Said had written about Freud's couch and the odalisque. And, his couch is so present in that space. It's basically, the Freud Museum is his office and his home, where he lived for this last year, where he wrote Moses and Monotheism. And it's where he and his family came to escape the Nazis from Vienna. So one of the things he took with him, as well as his practice, and I was really moved to find in his drawer of his desk, he had business cards made up, so that he was actually, even in his last year of life and in a new city, he was in business, that he was not giving up, that he was really ready to go. And I found that really moving, actually. And as well, he brought Abu Simbel. That was also really important to him. And that either hung over his couch sometimes or over his mantle. And so I wanted to address this relationship to the odalisque and also psychoanalysis and this sort of harem and this idea of, his notorious phrase that the woman's mind is this dark continent. Just before I had my show at the Freud Museum, there was a great exhibition in London of Matisse and his fabrics. Do you remember that? And then it went to the Met. And I saw it in both places. And I was really moved by that exhibition. And so this idea to bring Matisse and his fabrics, which always are really important to me, and also that texture in his work and his odalisques, and to kind of make that really apparent, make that really more of a lucid link between that and what Freud was proposing in some ways. And so I sort of beheaded Matisse's model and put myself, my head over her body, which I loved her body, so I left her body. It's this really big, strong body. I left her body and I put my head. I shifted the gaze, but I tried to keep her intensity because her original look is really intense. And so we've worked really hard to keep that. But I'm then looking at the artist or the analyst. And it's really funny. And then Freud's head is on Matisse's body. And if you look closely, and we did our best I could do to blend it, but you can really see that it's Freud's head on Matisse's body, and that Freud is looking kind of nervous and looking down at his notes. But Matisse, if you look at Matisse's hands, you think, oh, he knew that woman's body. There's a shift between the hand and the head that I think is really interesting in that piece. And this was my first sort of big solo exhibition, retrospective, mid-career retrospective, and they always want a lot of information and you feel very peeled. And I also wanted to make kind of play on that, where they have these kind of timelines, I wasn't being offered that because I didn't have that kind of timeline, that Matisse or somebody like that you would go see, or Cézanne. But I wanted to make a kind of play on that. And so I thought, well, let's make a projection. Let's say this is who Ellen Gallagher is. Right when you come into the space, instead of a big text, you will get this projection.
I wanted to ask about humour and the work, because obviously a lot of your work is dealing with themes which are devastating and terrible. But at the same time, humour is a crucial part of your work and in fact, different modes of address. Can you say something about how hard it is to find that right kind of approach to subjects? Because I imagine it must be a difficult balance to strike. Right.
There is a kind of humour that is really not a joke in a way. It's not a joke at all in terms of its gettability or its lucidity. A joke has to work in a different kind of way. I think the humor in my work, it's working towards a kind of agency. It's a kind of way to get over to another space when sometimes you're not going to make that space in the time frame of the work or the time frame of your life. I think music works like that as well. Certainly that can actually transport you to another kind of sense of being. And so for me, humor can do that. And it's not about releasing the terrible, it's really about traversing it.
Let's move on to the questions that we ask all our guests now. So, who was the first artist whose work you loved?
It's not that I'm embarrassed to say this, but it's a little bit long-winded, but I kind of have to get it to you in this way because I think it's important. Because I lived with it in my dorm room in African Heritage House at Oberlin College in Ohio. That's why this piece I want to speak to you about is important to me. And it's also about the way I came to this piece. There was a program started by a woman named Ellen Johnson, who was really important to Oberlin College and certainly to my life. She was a librarian and a professor. really radical woman, actually. And she also had a great influence at the school's art museum, the Allen Art Museum. And she had this idea, she wanted students, teachers, and even the wider community, cooks, cleaners, everybody in the community, to have access to great art. And she had this idea that you had to live with the art of your time. This was really important. So she started what she called this art rental program. You could just come and show your school ID at the beginning of the semester. She had like all of these artists' prints or works on paper. And she felt everyone could have access to it by showing their ID like a library card. You would show your ID, and then you could take away anything from this collection that she had convinced the school to give her money to go to New York and buy. And she was already hooked up in New York. So she had Goya, Matisse, Picasso, Miro, Toulouse-Lautrec, V.S. Selmans, Eva Hesse, Warhol, Faith Ringgold, Richter, Carrie Mae Weems. It was incredible collection of work. And I just remember it was on these tables. And of course, I was a teenager. I went a little bit early to school, and I showed my ID like everyone else. I was super excited. But of course, the art history students got there first. And I wouldn't have even really known what a Picasso was, but I thought that's what I was going to get. And, I felt really like embarrassed that I didn't know what things were. But what called to me was actually a work by Keith Haring. And it was Untitled #1, 1982. And it's a lithograph, black ink on white ground. And it's two dogs standing upright on two legs, laughing and barking. And you feel the sound in the work. And one of the dogs holds a TV over his shoulder. On screen, on the TV screen, is a dog on all fours. And the other standing upright dog is penetrating a man who is bent over between the two dogs. And it's a really magical work. I think it's about images and seeing. I felt it was about revolution. I thought it might be a picture of Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And again, this was Ronald Reagan had recently come to power. And even though I was a teenager, it was the first time that I felt as an adult I could see the changes or the implications of complicity, even on that college campus and in my country. And I still remember that feeling of being like so proud and that it was mine. It hung over my bed, and, we had these little tiny dorm rooms, not much bigger than your bed. So I would open my door and people would stand. So it was just incredible because people would stand and we would sort of riff on what it was about, and then, I don't know if it was about Gil Scott-Heron but maybe, and then, that led me to other artists like Ramel Z, who became really important to me. But I love the idea, speaking of projection again, that, actually Keith Haring begins his work, working in the kind of negative spaces in advertisements that haven't been sold. You get these black spaces. He would actually do this sort of white or silver in the negative spaces of an unsold advertisement in subways. And that kind of projection, I find that really beautiful. And I do think there is a kind of sound in his work. Really, when I say the dogs are laughing and barking, I'm sure of it. So there's all kinds of sounds that you feel them, like his characters have a kind of sound element to them.
How lovely. Which historical artist do you turn to the most?
Diego Velázquez. It's interesting. I didn't go to the Prado until I was much older. And I remember that when I had one of my first interviews, Peter Schedel called me up after he saw my show at Mary Boone, and he was very kind. But I just remember he said, I'm really curious what it will be like when you travel and you go to the Prado. Because clearly I had not been yet. Well, he asked me. He asked if I had been, and I think he spoke about his daughter, and that he was excited to look at things with her. And I went for the first time, or maybe it was the second time I went. It was the Velazquez Retrospective. So it was incredible to see it there with all their holdings and the loans. And of course, they have so much bargaining power, so they can really get any loan they want. And they have so many anyway because of the royal court. But it was that infant Felipe Prospero from 1659, the child that is about to die and that he knows will die. And I think they both are dying. I think it's at the end of Velázquez's life, and the child will die later that year as well. And the child is painted with so thin you can see like the curtains behind him coming through this really pale flesh. And then he has all these little bells on him, you know, to kind of keep him alive, to keep the spirits away. It's a really incredible picture. And also the portraits of girls in wigs, those royal children, adolescent girls that will then, the heartbreak of that, you know, there's these sewn in wigs into them, and that, you know, they think they're going to be marrying this boy they've been promised to, and then he dies, and then they have to marry his father, you know, and that's a lot to take in, I think, if you're 14, and you feel that, and the way he's negotiating being a court painter, and the detail, of course, is incredible.
I'm so pleased that you said about that, the portrait of Felipe Prospero. It's a heartbreaking painting, isn't it?
It's a really scary, scary painting. You know, it's just like this sorrow to come, and it's living. You're living with it right there.
And surely one of the most tender portraits of a dog in the history of painting.
Yeah, because he's in the place of one of the dwarfs, right? He knows everything. He sees what's coming. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about, in terms of historic works, the fact that in this current show, which is at Hauser and Wirth as we speak, there are these caryatid figures, these Congo figurines. I wanted to ask you about those, and had they long been sort of percolating in your mind as an image to use, or is it a recent discovery?
No. Well, that's the great thing about being in New York during the 90s, you know, to have access to the Met. And there was one sculpture in particular, Master of the Cascades, and that is in a work I did in, I want to say 2000, Dance You Monster, and it's a diptych. And I blew it up really large. And Master of the Cascades from the Congo. And I think I was really struck by the fact that this was an object used for ritual or for coiffure, you know, again, a kind of ritual, that I was reduced to seeing it in a two-dimensional plane because it was in a vitrine. So I was thinking about vitrines and what vitrines do to sculptural form. And anyway, that I was thinking about that, but then I was also thinking about like that idea of form and motion has been always really important to my work, and thinking about that when something is caught and kind of held in a kind of two-dimensional space. This idea of sculpture coming back into two-dimensional form, or sculpture or dance moving through form to another form, is really important to me. And actually, the title of the exhibition at Hauser and Wirth is Ecstatic Draft of Fishes, which comes from the Rubens Miraculous Draft of Fishes. And the version I'm referring to is actually in Cologne. And that's an oil sketch that I saw at the Boymans in Rotterdam, Boymans Museum. And right before it closed for like 7 years. Like now it's closed for 7 years for architecture again, like what the Dutch seem to do to all their museums. Like, let's just close for a decade and ruin everybody's life so we can make some ridiculous like extension. But anyway, but there was this lovely exhibition of Rubens' oil sketches. So this is an oil sketch. And this particular version of the Miraculous Draft of Fishes is really interesting, because unlike the one in London, which is a more full image, the ecstatic draft is singular. And it's really creepy. It's not a bunch of beautiful fish you would eat. It looks like a sea creature that is more like an omen than feeding you. So it's really exciting to see him working through these different sort of proposals, and they're radically different, you know, and that you can do that in a painting, or in a way that I think you couldn't do in a novel. I mean, I don't think you would write a novel and it would be so completely different. It's an absolutely different painting when you have like this sea creature that is really like a bad omen, rather than a fulfilling, and Christ isn't in that image as well, so it's like after but it's also interesting because he uses sculptural form to be the apostles. He uses the figures in the boat are actually from sculptures that he was looking at when he was in Villa Medici in Rome. So it's really interesting that he's already transferring sculpture into painting. And so I thought that's so interesting to do that with the Fang work, to sort of bring that back into the 2D space of painting.
I wanted to ask about the sort of problematics of referencing works of the past and how interesting it is in the context of your work, because we've already talked about Matisse in the context of Odalisque, but also your consistent references to Milevich's Black Square. And this utter revelation that I hadn't known about until I was reading about your work, which is that beneath the black square, there's a racist joke, and this prompted a body of your work. Can you explain more about that?
Well, it's not sure. I mean, we will never get to the bottom of that, you know. So we can say, you said it perfectly. This has appeared, has been revealed. But we know that already, before we even get to that point, that for more than, decades, that painting has been, again, the paint surface is unstable. And so we've seen a kind of figurative form underneath that is already has a relationship to, something that Toni Morrison calls this Africanist presence in Western literature. And so I think there's an Africanist presence in Western painting as well. And so clearly, already I was thinking about that in terms of what's underneath. This zero sum is actually built over something, So that's clear even before this thing surfaced. And so it's, of course, now there's some idea that perhaps it's not in his handwriting. That hasn't been proven yet. We don't know if it's Malevich's handwriting. We do know it's there. That's what we know for sure, is that it's there, but who did it? And I don't know that we will be allowed to find that out, so. But that idea, I thought, what does it mean? For that racist joke was already there before Malevich makes the painting, of course, because of Alphonse Allais. And that was also a joke in a sense that was something that Turner faced, that idea of abstraction, that like the impossibility of abstraction. So it's a joke a little bit about that. And then in my hands, when that impossibility of abstraction is, that's when you speak about humor. It's this kind of humor that is, well, indeed, yeah. It is impossible.
And so you made a body of work called Negroes Battling in a Cave in response to this information, essentially.
Yeah. That would then be a series. I wanted it to be a series and in motion. And in some ways to reference back to, of course, the eclipse of the, what I consider the earliest American abstraction, which is blackface minstrelsy, the eclipse of the African body into American blackface. And Ralph Ellison references this, of course, as well in The Invisible Man. And so these kind of stories are moving in the work. And I think, for me, it doesn't just exist in the title. And it's the same thing with humor. And as opposed to a joke, it exists in this kind of threshold, this space of the subject that we can share together. And that is where there's a kind of hope in the work, if there could be one, is that can we get to a point where we can travel these forms together and create this space where we can be in this shared space around some of this threshold?
Let's talk about contemporary artists. Which contemporary artist do you most admire?
Well, I mean, interestingly, speaking of projection, I think, I have to think of the Dutch artist Stanley Brouwn is super important to me. And him as a kind of direct line out of Mondrian and his measurements and his refusals. He's a kind of parallel of David Hammond's. Maybe he would be a little bit older, an artist that refused to be photographed as he matured as an artist. And he refuses a kind of catalog entry and a kind of mention of him. In a way, he's kind of erasing himself to project himself forward in the future. But basically, he's somebody who comes to Amsterdam from Suriname and has spent his whole career measuring his body, and as if to say, so everything is about steps and his own position, in the world. And also the way that he was super important and an inventor of conceptualism of the 70s. In fact, in Darby English's incredible book, among others, that he did, really excavating the Moma story, super incredible. He has these notes where they are considering Stanley Brouwn. Someone suggests in a meeting, I don't know how Darby got these meeting notes, somebody suggests that Stanley Brouwn should be given a solo exhibition because he's such an important developer of conceptualism. And he's referred to as an African-American permanently displaced in Europe. I thought that was really, so that's how his identity was phrased in this. I thought that was really interesting. So, I mean, I don't know what he thought about that. And he didn't get the exhibition anyway, but
Yeah, that would be another story. Yeah, I mean,
and of course, connected to that, I was really blown away by the Adrian Piper exhibition at the MoMA that Christophe Cherix did. That I got to go in. I never do that, ask a favor, but I got to go in like a couple hours before the crowd came, because once everybody came in, it was really hard to unpack that exhibition. But I got to be just with a friend in that space together, and we could read and really get into it. And her mappings of her studio, I'd never made a link between her and Stanley Brouwn before, and I got it. And thinking about them coming out of also Théosophie and Mondrian was really interesting to think about.
That is really interesting. And it's interesting the point that you make about scale and about reading, because your work is very dense and it requires time and energy. You know, yes, there are spectacular effects that can be seen from across a room, but also...
That's nice you say that, because I think they don't have a lot of wall power, my works. I'm installing in Arnhem now, and I was saying Bonaventure had this white cut paperwork. He put it really directly under a stained glass window, and maybe we'll keep it. I don't know. But I thought like, I don't know. I felt like, don't worry. It doesn't have any wall power. It's okay. but maybe that's not the thing to say to your curator.
But I would.
That's like a thing in New York. Like people really, when you hear, they're like, it's got real wall power. It seems to be like people like Roberta Smith and Jerry Saltz really love things that have wall power, and they talk about that. You know, I think these people work really hard and go and see a lot of things. And I really think, though, you started to hear that phrase a lot from the 2000s, and it really has to do with like things getting full and speeded up. And yeah, I don't think it's the only way to go, but I understand it could be valid. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. There's a really interesting thought in terms of your work, because I would say your work does have wall power, and I would say that probably the key thing is that if your work does have wall power, it has something more, and yours, of course, does. So tell me about striking that balance, because, of course, your work does require an engagement close up. You cannot gauge the work without really moving in close. Yeah,
and I think it also does not reproduce. And that's something I think about a lot. And I certainly worry about it. And I'm joking. And I also worry about the wall power thing for sure. But, you know, I also think of forms that I really love that also don't reproduce. Like, you know, when I was a student, you still had go-go music was really big coming out of DC. And that music never moved into like the world stage the way hip hop did, you know, and I think that has to do with the fact that you can't record it and you can't translate it, because if it's like 20 guys on a stage, like all playing the drums, it's hard to make a recording of it. It's something I guess you have to be there. And I think that can be a really exciting thing that's something I've thought about, especially during this time when I've been not able to go to museums and see things. I've missed that. And I think like to actually be able to go into spaces again, this is what I'm really looking forward to. But also that I know I have to get my energy right for it again, right?
What works do you have pinned to the studio wall, or do you not have anything pinned to the studio wall?
I have things that stay on the wall, and then I have things that shift on the wall. But one piece that stays on the wall and that I did get to see in person, that's why it's on the wall, is Hugo van der Gogh's diptych with the Fall of Man and the Lamentations from 1475. And that's for the devil, the picture of the devil in that. It's not, you know, this like grotesque. It's really creepy. It's really scary because it's about curiosity. It's just like creepy. It's just turning its head and looking at them, and it's just so disturbing. And the color is so disturbing. And it's, you know, it's miniature, but it's just a really frightening piece. And it's a concept of the devil as, you know, as just like a disturbance in the plane.
This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. The app offers access to over 30 cultural institutions through a single download, with new partners being added every month. Among the digital guides available on the app is one dedicated to the Drawing Centre in New York, which held Ellen Gallagher's exhibition Preserve in 2002, as well as a series of mixed media drawings taken from advertisements in mid-century black culture magazines. The show included the artist's first major three-dimensional work, a large white painted construction resembling a jungle gym. If you download Bloomberg Connects, you can find out about the current exhibitions at the Drawing Centre and hear the curatorial team talk about selected artworks. The digital guide also provides educational resources, including drawing activities. For more content and to explore guides to all the partnering institutions, download Bloomberg Connects today. You can find the app at bloombergconnects.org. It's also available to download from the App Store and Google Play. Which museum or gallery do you visit most frequently?
So that would be the Prado now. But that's like as an adult, not young. Yeah. Before that, a really important site to me would have been Trinity Square Repertory Theater in Providence, Rhode Island. And because I was an usher there. I was there before Anne Bogart, and I was there during Anne Bogart and after. And it was very exciting to see her come. And she wrecked the place with her great work. Like, it suddenly became empty. The actors remained the same core group. And she brought in Maria Arin Fornes. And so this was what I got to see as like a, I don't know, was I 14 or 15 or something? And this was incredible. And I got to see the town not be able to handle her. So that was really important. And then I went to art school. And of course, the Museum of Fine Arts was super important to me that I went to that school. But I think the Prado is the most important, the museum I need to go to. And I schedule that in to go to that. Yeah.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
So in between Oberlin and the museum school was a little bit of time where I tried to figure out what I wanted to do. And one of the things I did that was incredible and led me to art school was I did something called Sea Semester out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And it's Sea Education Association. And it has sort of, there's the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute is there. So it's really, they have this rich library and also scientists to pull from. So you study celestial navigation in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and sailing. And then we all met. So we were a group of like 20 people all around, I don't know, by then I was 19 or 20. I think I turned 20 then. And we sailed, we did this loop around the Caribbean. And this was incredible for me. One, to move from one island to another. And also what we were doing. I mean, we were on a sailboat. So we say a research vessel, but it was really, we were sailing that thing. And it was incredible and a lot of work. And we were split into 3 groups. So we were all really responsible for moving ourselves from one place to another. And my project that I developed at the last minute, not really being a scientist or studying really science, I saw a scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute give a slide talk, and he showed these images of pteropods, and they were gorgeous. They just were these 2-footed sails that were moving through the water columns. And so I thought, that's it. That's my project. But I hadn't really done the work and didn't realize that they were microscopic or not really any bigger than your fingernail. So it turned out to be, people thought, well, you're hardcore. That's intense. I mean, so I didn't realize what I'd set myself up for, but it meant, sort of, doing these net tows through the water columns because they are diurnal migrators. So they're moving through the water columns. And my idea was that I was going to, because they move through, they have some mobility, I was going to use them to map out the kind of Caribbean. So I was going to map where they were and create this overview, because that was also what struck me being on this boat for all this time, was like that the sea was not one thing, that it was made up of all these different bodies of water. And that really struck me. And also when we would land in different places, the other thing that nobody really talked about, but for me, it was really intense. We landed from being in this New England, pretty much white environment. We went to the Caribbean, and we didn't land in like the fancy yachty harbors. We landed in the working harbors of these places. So we landed in the working harbors of Martinique. And at that time, you could walk through the neighborhood. For me, we landed in a kind of black universe. And I was blown away. I was just blown away. We would walk through this neighborhood and into Fort-de-France. There is a little port in Fort-de-France, but that's like if you have a lot of money, you can sail in there. And in Fort-de-France, it was just incredible being in, and the students were fighting for the right to take the baccalaureate. We walked into a student protest which was incredible. And then also the Victor Sulzer Library. So these things just blew me away. And so in a way, it was the beginning of another thinking about America or the Americas and the Caribbean, and led me to be really fascinated by writers like Aimé Césaire and Edwige Dandicott. And, you know, it was so strange, like Jamaica was English and Saba was Dutch and Martinique was French. It was just very, very disturbing. I mean, I remember it was really very powerful and moved me. And then, you know, right from that going into art school, and it was physically moving and psychically moving in every way to this program.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, that there was this moment at which the study of biology and the study of culture and the study of history sort of converged so sort of palpably in your experience?
For my experience, that was really true. I don't know what other people were thinking about when they were, but that's what happened to me, of course. I was really struck by that. And I'm really grateful for the experience. You know, I'm incredibly grateful. And it was scary to do because I didn't know what it would lead to. You know, I didn't know, you know, it seemed a little bit frivolous to take this time off and do this, you know, and it was a lot of an investment of time and my student loans. And, but I did it, and I'm really glad I did it.
Let's talk about literature. You've already referred to Aimé Césaire there. Which writers or poets do you return to the most?
Recently, you know, Edwige Dandicott, always returning to her. Dewbreaker, you know, is the title of her work. You know, I love that she starts off, you know, it's a series of stories that are wound together. And like Maryse Condé, she has this way of bringing scent into her work. You know, Maryse Condé, it's often flowers, because, you know, scent, like sound, isn't something you can contain, you know, so it's something that is beyond any kind of, you know, kind of like instability in my work. You know, it's something that is not fixed in a way, and it can't be contained in a nation. You can't draw a line and say, well, this smell will end here. You know, so you smell when you're approaching land, you know, you smell the heat from the land, and when you approach it from the water, and you hear, and so but you smell even before you hear, I think. Yeah, it's strange. But the way that, you know, Dewbreaker starts off with this idea of palimpsest in her work, and that she's trying to make a portrait of her father. She's an artist trying to make a sculpture of her father, and she can't seem to find it. And the whole series of stories is about her finding this picture that she kind of couldn't really face, and these ways that, like, these images like that exist, you know, a poster in, you know, the way that Haiti moves into Brooklyn, and there's a poster for a wanted man, but it's all vague and torn. And so there's this idea of palimpsest again, and that the community is looking for who were the Dewbreaker, you know, who were these torturers. And then she finds, you know, that in a sense that we are the Dewbreaker, you know, that we in that idea of that there is a kind of usness to the violence as well, that I think that idea of recovery that has to be done in a kind of webbing.
And tell me about Aimé Césaire. Is there a particular body of work? Because it often in connection with your work, the Ode à la Guinée is mentioned. Is this as important as it sounds?
I think besides Ode à la Guinée, it's also the idea that he does get to go study, but he would have been an exceptional case, right? He and Senghor meet in Paris at the Sorbonne. And this is really interesting to me right now, actually, because they meet at the Sorbonne and they form together this idea of negritude, you know, and of course Glissant fights back against that, about a more Caribbean specificity, but still this idea that they kind of had the right to be at the Sorbonne as exceptional Negroes, but they went beyond that and they forged something together to say, no, that's not actually the role we intend to take. You know, we're going to take something back with us and we are going to keep ourselves together. Thank you, Paris, for introducing us to each other. You know what I mean? So this is what they did, and they brought this back. And this is such an important part of critical race theory right now, and it has been for my whole education, what they did in terms of Pan-Africanism and negritude and creolité, and this idea that you could choose your own nation within your nation. Even that, I'm talking to you about this Keith Haring lithograph in African Heritage House. That was a big deal for me. I chose to live there, and I chose that work. It was the beginnings of a kid sort of making, like every kid has to do, become like grown up and make some choices about how you want to be in the world. And their example and what they formed, we are still in that. And so it's incredible to me that Macron has recently come out so publicly. He's basically said there's like an invasion or an infiltration in French culture by American academics. And he's specifically attacking Black feminist theory, of course. It's incredible to me that he's blind to like the fact that we are so bound together, and the importance of Black Francophone cultural discourse in America. It is something that, you see like how terrified American government has been historically of Haiti and of Cuba, that our nation is afraid of the Caribbean and what Black independence and Black sovereign space could be. And so I think it's really interesting when I hear Macron say that, and I'm living in Rotterdam, it makes me so angry. And it's also, he's blind to his own nation, in a sense. He's blind to the beauty of what happened in France, in Francophone diaspora.
One of the things, hearing you say that and talking about those figures, is about the different kinds of influence that writers, poets, musicians, artists can exert over other artists, in the sense that some have a kind of moral influence or ethical influences, but then others have very formal connections and things like that. And are you conscious of that kind of, in a way, a kind of constellation of different forms of influence that is around you?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm conscious of it, to be honest. And I give myself a lot of time to think about it. For example, speaking of Senghor and César, I mean, for example, in a more contemporary, Drexciya, when I first discovered their music would have been their 1997 manifesto. But I was soon to be moving to be in Berlin for a year. I began showing in England. I was in Catherine de Zager's exhibition, Inside the Visible, that went to Whitechapel from the ICA Boston, which is where she met me and saw my work. And so the idea of not just showing in the UK, but then what would it mean to make an exhibition in Berlin with my work and my content, and could I travel my abstraction? Well, Drexia, coming out of Detroit and being so huge in Germany, in Berlin, and not just Berlin, all over Europe, and also Derek May and Jeff Mills. I mean, to this day, I have walked into a nightclub a few years ago in Rotterdam, and Jeff Mills was playing, and it was like call and response. The audience knew him so well. He held them, he controlled them. They knew what was coming. They knew the work so well. They were moving to it. It was so incredible. This like cheer went up when he would shift to something else, or it was really wild. And, you would see their posters around. So you knew that, they're really here, in this space. And that's been something like more than in the visual art world in the Netherlands. There's a kind of music world here that is incredible, that is on a whole other level than what is happening if you would go to a museum or a gallery here, for example, in terms of like culture and contemporary culture and diasporic form. But, Drexcia, they really created a space for me to imagine myself in abstraction and in the world, that it could travel.
We'll talk about music again in a minute, but I can't let us get away from literature without asking you about Moby Dick. Moby Dick is a work that continually comes up in connection with your work. You've made works directly in response to it, haven't you? Can you tell me about that journey that you've been on with that book, really?
Yeah. Well, I have to say that I did read Moby Dick in school. So I had a really great teacher in school. Like the one class, I Blossom Kirschenbaum was incredible. And we read The Bluest Eye, Bernard Malamud. So we read Moby Dick, and I can't say that I really got it. But we read also Benito Cereno. And this was incredible for me. So it's not just Moby Dick for me. That's really important, of course. But for me, it was Benito Cereno and The Confidence Man, where I found I was shocked I found him to be a shocking race writer, and nobody was saying that, and he was so nuanced. It was like his words jumped across all these years right into my mind, and he was, especially being in New England. I mean, I was, from a working class background, and I went to Quaker school for a bit, and there's this kind of waspy liberalism that's very condescending that used to creep me out and was really, really hard on, especially on like my mom, when she would bring me to school, because she's very working class Irish. And so she would be kind of checked, by the school she was struggling to send me to. But I was fabulous because I was, I was a Black student. I always really remember this class. It was sort of like blackness was its own class. And then there was this other kind of class hierarchy. And Melville seemed to address that. When he talks about, in Benito Cereno, like all of his narrators, an unstable narrator, he's taking us in and he doesn't know what's going on. And so there's been a slave insurrection, and they are actually pretending to still be enslaved. And there's a moment where the captain tries to reach out to the narrator to say, oh, help. But his very faithful manservant decides this is the time he needs to have a shave. And there's this scene where he puts the flag across his master's body and carefully shaves his neck and says, "Don't move, sir. I would hate for you to get cut. It'd be so horrible." And he's carefully shaving this, and it's so sensual. And the narrator is thinking, oh my God, he's being shaved with a flag across his chest. And that that this captain is clearly decrepit, but his manservant is so loyal and so tender. And slowly it's revealed, and it's because he's so condescending. He's actually speaking to the abolitionists, that their refusal of Black sovereign space in a way, and he's speaking to that power. I mean, we don't really look to Melville for like a kind of, and we know he's not writing about, when he says about manhood, he means really manhood. He doesn't mean if women are not, but still, he's incredible. And the confidence man is basically, the whole story is in blackface. And that's the whole question is, it takes place on this steamship, and there are all these different narratives that happen. Each chapter is its own narrative, and it's its own guise. And what you never realize is, are there these many crooks on this steamship, on America, or is it one person in disguise the whole time? So there are all these kind of disguises and stories. He's really somebody who dresses the rot at the core of America, of the promise of America. And I think for that, he's really silenced. And he's silenced on purpose as a race writer, I think.
So let's return to music. Let's talk about Drexciya, because it's at the heart of your work, this Afro-futurist, but it comes from techno as opposed to jazz like Sun Ra. So tell us about that myth and what it means to you in terms of your work.
An origin myth could be at an unfixed site, at the site of violence, as opposed to an origin myth in terms of being not the plantation and neither sort of a return to, Marcus Garvey return. It's not this kind of return to Africa. It's not Liberia, nor is it the plantation. And so for me, Drexciya offered this proposal that we needed to think about this site, that it's actually this space of the sea, that the change happens in captivity. I mean, it's such an eloquent way to speak of this sort of terrible site as a kind of sublime, and which is always about a kind of terror, right? I mean, the sublime is always about a decay and a terror. And so this idea of this sea sublime that they come up with, of course, it's super important to me, but and the sound as well, that it's like, it can be so analog and so melodic on the one hand, or it can just be beep, 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 it can really, like, such a wide ranging, it's the same thing like with Kraftwerk, when you think of the melodics in Kraftwerk and you think why can they get away with this? Like, why, where you can see, like, this clearly has roots in German romanticism, right? And why is, like, craft work okay? Of course, yes. I mean, I went to the Tate and I got to see that. That was very moving. And then somebody like Anselm Kiefer less so. It's interesting to think about. Like, I mean, these are the things I think about. Like, why is that something that musically we allow these kind of traverses through, a kind of fascist landscape, and then it's much more difficult visually, but musically I don't know why that is. It's something I think about. I think about that as an art problem that is interesting to me. I think in some ways this idea of Drexcia I understand this idea of a kind of a militarized zone beneath the sea. And I get it. But for me, I think in some ways I move away from Drexcia in a sense that I'm really all about the womb. What I'm really struck by with the mythos is this idea of the grief. And so, I always sort of euphemistically say women that went overboard, because there's also some agency in that, also an agency in death. And I think there is a kind of that loss of motherhood, or that loss of your child, that in some ways I think the militarized zone of Drexcia, the band, the manifesto, for me, it in some ways denies the grief of the mother. And I want to stay with the mother. So, there's divergences, but of course they're super influential as well.
Yeah. And those caryatid figures that we were talking about earlier on, do you see those as symbols of those women, or is that too neat a way of reading
No,
it?
I do. I mean, obviously, they're female. I've chosen that. It's very clear. I mean, it's not really, they're not voluptuous in terms of, there's this kind of breast form. And actually, I did change them a bit, because the actual sculpture is Breastfeeding Twins. I did try to, I thought like, oh, that's a bit much. So for me to transfer that. So she's actually breastfeeding. So that's why the breasts are really present. And I think of them also as a kind of female generative form. But I don't see them only as mother. I see them also as the child, the weaving of a kind of offspring,
Those underwater spaces, they're often extremely beautiful. You talk about the sublime and terror, and the idea that the underwater space is a space of beauty, and yet at the same time in those works where you're talking about the sort of the bottom of the sea, where there are animals that feed on the bones of whales, it's a space of both terror and beauty at the same time, isn't it?
Exactly. And this idea of, we have no access to it. We are able to travel in machines down into submersibles. You feel that we don't belong there and we don't have access to it. And that's really magical to me. Like, that's such deep space,
In terms of music that you listen to as you work, would you listen to techno? Would Drexcia be on your playlist?
Alice Coltrane just has new music out that is devotional music she made in the 80s with an organ that her son has just released. Ravi Coltrane released. It's incredible. So I am listening to that, and it's driving everybody crazy because I'm listening to it over. That's what I do. I listen to things over and over again, and then I switch it up. And so right now I'm definitely in that rant. But, I listen to the BBC. I listen to Stuart Marconi's Freak Zone. So I love that. And I think when I'm really working, I sometimes like to listen to that, just put that on and see and just be surprised. But it's funny because something must be changing in me, because I used to, whenever that would come on, I would say, oh, get that off. That guy is taking advantage of us. But now I felt like I had more space for what he's doing, and I enjoy him.
Can there be too much content audio-wise while you're working, especially because your work is so complicated?
My studio is right in the port of Rotterdam. So when the tugboats come back and tie up, there's like this bonk. You feel the whole building move. And right now it's raining on the roof, and the roof is metal. So I love all these sounds. Yeah, and just like there's people working on the docks, and that you're really in a port. So sometimes I don't want to hear that, and sometimes that's all I want to hear.
Is there a particular discipline in your daily working life that you see as an essential ritual?
I guess I clean my studio sometimes. When I clean my studio, it's not a daily ritual, but I do it myself. I sort of go through the mediums and the colors, and sometimes like just doing that will decide like what I'll use in a new work. And then I ride my bike back and forth to the studio, and I have to ride through the port. My house is also along the port, so I ride through the port and back and forth each day.
And that sort of important thinking space, as it were.
I think so. Yeah, it is. It is. Because I know it, and it's a kind of a bike trail the whole way. So there's no real, like, I'm not going to get run over by a truck or something. You know, I can really just be in my head and ride. Yeah.
If you could live with one work of art, what would it be?
Well, I mean, just to be in keeping with this conversation, I suppose I should say I would live with Jan Mostert's portrait of an African man. It's an incredible painting of a man that's in the Rijksmuseum. And they don't have a huge collection of Flemish primitives. They're more sort of focused on the golden era. So that painting is incredible because, you know, it's just quiet. It's you know, it's not a really large painting, and it is, I don't know how to look at it. I realized, I thought, wow, you know, there's so much, you know, white noise around that figure, and he's this young, beautiful figure. He's outside of caricature. So it's, you know, when it's a Flemish primitive, he was apparently in the court, and he's a bodyguard, and so he's armed, he's wealthy, he's black, he's very beautiful. And I showed that to the historian Robin Kelly, and Robin said something so beautiful to me. He said, you know, he sort of is enabling that portrait. And this is something that takes my breath away. This spirit of this man, he is sitting for this portrait, and he is presenting himself, you know, sort of back to Stanley Brouwn in the sense of projecting yourself forward, that I am trying to find a way to see him. And it's actually, I don't have the ability to see him. And so when I go to that, I feel my loss to know this person who's just existing as an African man in the court before the industrialization of slavery, that we can't, you know, to get to that space of, to how to see him again. And I think that is work that will still, is something we need to do together, that we will, you know, people like, you know, librarians and historians and different kinds of practices. This will start to be, you know, people like Anne Lafont and in Paris and Denise Morel in New York are doing this work. Curators and historians how do we uncover what is there for us to uncover, you know, that Africanist presence that is haunting Western painting. This is exciting to me, and work that I think is the work of our time.
And lastly, what is art for?
It's for being together at this threshold. When you look at something, you create your tribe with you of looking, people who are looking and seeing. And I think it's emancipatory, and it's a kind of projection forward towards something else.
Ellen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
Ellen's exhibition, Ecstatic Draft of Fishes, is at Hauser and Wirth in London until the 31st of July. She mentioned that she's installing in Arnhem in the Netherlands, and that's for the quadrennial exhibition Sonsbeck. The artistic director is Bonaventure So Bejeng de Kung, and his exhibition, in which Ellen is showing work in the Watery Ecstatic series, is called Force Times Distance, on labour and its sonic ecologies. It runs from the 2nd of July until the 29th of August at various locations in Arnhem. Ellen's also in the group show Mirrors and Windows at the Filara Collection in Dusseldorf until the 3rd of October, and she's in a show at the Andries Eyck Gallery in Amsterdam called On Paper until the 31st of July. Ellen's major work Deluxe, one of the works featuring a grid of found and transformed magazine pages, is on view at the Broad in Los Angeles as part of the group exhibition Invisible Sun. That's also until the 3rd of October. And another group show featuring Ellen's work, New Time, Art and Feminisms in the 21st Century, opens at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive at the University of Berkeley in California from the 28th of August until the 30th of January next year. And that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. And do also subscribe to our other podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues. We're on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producers of the Art Newspaper podcasts are Julia Michalska and Amy Dawson. Thanks to Henrietta Bentel, Daniela Hathaway and Kabir Jalla. Huge thanks to Ellen Gallagher and to Edgar Klein. Join us on Friday for the last episode of the present season of The Week in Art, and we'll be back at the end of July with more episodes of A Brush With. Bye for now. This episode of A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.